Born to Greek immigrants in Massachusetts, he eventually became the longest-serving governor in that state's history. And in 1988, he was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. But his name and campaign will always be linked to the Republican political ad featuring furloughed rapist Willie Horton and the image of the candidate driving a tank, two often-cited reasons for his eventual loss to George H.W. Bush. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with politician and one-time presidential hopeful, Michael Dukakis. Do you ever get to a point where you stop wondering, what if? Do you ever look at the country today and say, if we had done this?
Well, Ernie, kiddingly, I say to people these days, if I'd beaten the old man, you'd have never heard of the kid and we wouldn't be in this mess. So it's all my fault and I take personal responsibility for it. But, you can't belabor the thing. I mean, you can't go back over and over again. It was disappointing. I had done a terrific job in the primary, a lousy job, I'm sorry to say, in the final, which is why I lost it. But sure, I regret it in many ways because I think things would have been different.
But do you look today when you read the paper, and do you look at it as a sports person would watch and read the sports page and say, that should have gone this way, or I can see what...
Well, if you've been in public life as long as I have, I mean, I was governor for 12 years, a legislator before that, presidential candidate and so forth, and you are as engaged in it as I am, and you never get out of it. People say to me, well, it must be better now because you're out of it. I mean, you're never out of it. And I'm deeply and actively involved, both back in Massachusetts and to some extent, at least nationally. Sure, I mean, you're always wondering. I mean, I think invading Iraq may be the dumbest thing the United States has ever done. And I felt that from the beginning. And I haven't changed my mind given what's happened. So sure, you can't, as I see us spend $4 billion a week on this fiasco, and I think about the things we could do with those kinds of resources. How could you not say, why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? And to the extent that I can, I mean, I'm just one person, but the extent that I can, obviously I want to work with like-minded people. This election coming up is very important, and I hope we can change things in the White House and in Congress as well. And sure, so you're into it, but it's not a question of going back and saying, if I done this, that, or something else, I might have got myself elected. I mean, you can't go back and rerun that thing over and over again.
Yeah. When did the taste for public service first enter your life?
I was 7 years of age, if you can believe this, when I and my brother, who was 10, opened up what we used to call a card table in the middle of our living room in 1940 in Brookline, Massachusetts, and listened to the two national conventions set up lists of the then 48 states, and were taking down the delegate count. Now, 7 years of age. I think some of it had to do with my ethnic background. Greeks, as you know, quite political. Mm-hmm. And from the earliest age, I used to listen to hot political discussions around the dinner table and when we got together with our relatives, more sometimes about Greek politics than American politics. But, my parents were both immigrants, but they were proud Greek Americans, proud of their heritage, but very proud of the country that had accepted them, and they had done remarkably well. And there was always this sense in my household that particularly those of us who had benefited so much from the fact that our parents had come to this country and had been welcomed and had done well. I mean, you had a responsibility to be deeply and actively involved in your community, and I think that had a lot to do with it. But people used to say to me during the presidential campaign, when did you first run for elective office? And I used to say, in Mrs. Ripley's third grade class at the E.C. Baker School, I ran for president of the class and got elected. I mean, don't ask me why. But so I was always into school politics, and over time got into the real thing.
You talk about your Greek heritage, and you talk about the importance of what that means to you. Oftentimes people think of Greeks as very passionate, very expressive in their emotions. Yet one criticism of yours is that you're much more reserved in all of that. Is that something you worked to achieve, or is it just who you are by nature?
Well, the reality is I'm not. You know, people used to say to me, I mean, the press used to say to me, well, you know, you're kind of a technocrat. And I'd say, I don't know who you're talking about. I mean, you can't get elected and reelected governor of Massachusetts 3 times and be dull. There's a problem, however. When you run for national office and you run for the presidency, it is very difficult, much more so than I ever found in state politics, to give people a sense of who you really are. I mean, I've often used the example of Bob Dole. Bob Dole is the funniest, wittiest guy I've ever met. I'm not kidding. I mean, he's got this wonderful sense of humor. He's, you know, we don't agree on a lot of things, but an easy guy to work with and so forth. You never got that sense about Dole. I mean, the poor guy looked like an undertaker in the 96
So
election.
Why is it? What is the problem in our
It's
system?
difficult. For one thing, people see you mostly in 8-second snippets, if they see you at all on television. It is very difficult to give people a sense of who you are in 8 seconds. You know, you clear your throat and that's it. And many of us, whether it's Dukakis or Dole or the rest of us, have grown up politically in living rooms and backyards and barbecues and the New England clam bakes. And people really have a chance to get to know us over a period of time. Running for the presidency is very difficult. Now, every once in a while, a Reagan or a Clinton will come along who have a rare ability to connect with people in 15 seconds on television, but most of us don't have that. So, you know, one of the challenges, which I didn't deal with very effectively, was how do you, under these circumstances, try to give people some sense of who you really are? And it's difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, people who know me know that I'm not, at least I don't think I'm dull, and I'm not a technocrat, and I feel passionately about things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been in public life for the past 40 years. But it's very tough to convey that.
With that said, then, do we elect our officials in the wrong way? Do we judge things incorrectly?
Well, personality is a part of this. I mean, people say, well, is likability an important asset? Of course it is. I mean, people want to kind of have a sense that the person they're voting for the most important political office in the world at least has some sense of who they are and what their problems are and relates to them. So we shouldn't be surprised if personality is an issue. It's just that it's much more difficult. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, there are ways of it. I'm not sure ways to do it. I'm not sure I did it very well in 1988, but I don't know if you remember. In 92, after Bill Clinton and Al Gore were nominated at the convention in New York, they got on a bus with their spouses and started traveling across the country. Now, it was supposed to be a 2 or 3 day trip from New York to St. Louis. It was hugely successful. I mean, thousands of people were coming out in small towns to meet them. Mm-hmm. And so they continued for another 3 days. And from that point on, 3 or 4 days in every week, Clinton and Gore were on a bus in a different part of the country, stopping in small towns. I mean, if there were 100 people in a cornfield, they would stop, drove the Secret Service crazy, but they insisted on doing it. I was very impressed with that. I'm sorry I didn't do it myself for 2 reasons. First, it gives people a much better sense of who you are. You get enormous local press coverage, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it grounds the candidates. I mean, there's something about going up in the air, going to your next stop, hitting the airport, making a speech, getting back on the plane, going up in the air, going to the next airport, that really dulls you. I mean, it's not very interesting. And I remember Al Gore coming to Boston during that campaign, I think it was in September, and talking about the people coming up to them and talking about their problems with health care and what an impact it had on him. So it's not just that it's good politics to do this. It has a real impact on the candidates themselves and kind of gets you on the ground in the real America. And that's one. There may be other ways to do it. That's one way of doing this. But somehow, whoever the candidate is, you've got to come up with a way to keep connected to people. And it's very difficult, particularly when you're surrounded by Secret Service people. Their job is to keep people away from you. I mean, I was a governor who never had security, refused to have it, took the streetcar to work, loved the fact that I could continue to stay connected to the people I was supposed to represent. I mean, once you say yes to security, it's a different ballgame. And I found it difficult, frankly, and didn't do well at it because of that.
I wanted to take you back and do more, but since we're right here, I'll talk about this then now. You talk about all these things that you know now, and you ran a great preliminary campaign. You know,
Indeed.
you went through the early part. Well, did you know at the time that it was going wrong,
After a while. Look, I made a deliberate decision. It turned out to be the biggest mistake I ever made, that I would not respond to the Bush attack campaign. That I just wasn't going to do it. And that was a huge mistake. I mean, if the other guy's going to come at you, you've got to be ready for it, and you've got to have a pretty carefully thought out strategy for dealing with it. Otherwise, you're going to get killed.
So what was the strategy not to respond? Why?
Because the Reagan years had been very polarizing years. I thought people were ready for something different. Not unlike, by the way, what we are in right now. I had run a very positive campaign in the primary, very successfully. People seemed to respond to that. And I made the mistake of assuming that continuing that, notwithstanding what was a carefully planned attack campaign from the other side, would be successful. And in any way, that's the kind of guy I am. I mean, I'm not wild about negative campaigning. I don't like it. I don't like being on the receiving end. I really don't like doing it to the other guy. But it was a mistake. I mean, unfortunately, particularly if you're the Democratic candidate, you better expect the attack campaign to begin the day after you get the nomination or even clinch the nomination. And I really didn't understand that. And by the time I woke up to what was happening, a lot of damage had been done.
I'd read a story that current President Bush, when his first campaign for president, that he was not aware how bad things were looking for him. And it was his wife seeing something on Oprah. And when he came home from a jog, she said, you know what, you better take a moment and take a look at what's going on out there because you're not aware of it. And that's where it turned around for him.
And by the way, spouses can be very helpful in kind of waking you up to that. Because remember, you're in the middle of this kind of cocoon. You're moving every day. You're out there. And really, I'm not sure that you really perceive reality. I mean, you're doing everything you can to be a good candidate, but you can't be your own campaign manager, your own strategist, your own media advisor, and that kind of stuff. But in any event, did I know we were in trouble by early September? Sure I did. There's no question about it.
Does panic then enter into it? Do you start worrying so much about winning that you lose track of what you're doing?
No, you don't do that. And remember, most of us who run for the presidency have been in public life for a long time. It's not the first time you've campaigned. Now, don't get me wrong. Running for the presidency is like nothing else in politics. I don't care how many times you've been governor, United States senator, whatever. But you can't panic. I mean, you really... And we worked very hard, came back toward the end very strong, but unfortunately the gap was just too big.
Okay, back to your youth again then. You entered into public life doing a councilman, committee member, what was it?
So, folks in Texas wouldn't understand this, but in New England, if they've read their history books, the colonial towns ran themselves with a board of selectmen, as it was called, and an open town meeting. In other words, the town legislature, if you will, the town legislative body, was every registered voter who wanted to show up at the annual town meeting. That's when the budget was voted and so forth, and citizens, in effect, were their own legislators. Now, as time went on, many of the New England towns began to get big. Kitty and I happened to grow up in the town of Brookline, which is immediately west of Boston. It's got 60,000 people. I mean, a little difficult to have an open town meeting unless you rent Fenway Park for the occasion. And so the legislature, back in the early 1900s, authorized these larger towns to create what we call representative town meetings, 240 elected town meeting members who are the town legislature. Now, you don't get paid, you meet 6 times a year and so on. But that was the first office I ran for, from a precinct of 3,000 voters. You know, rang every doorbell, stood in front of the polling place all day long, got myself elected. That's where I started.
Do you enjoy campaigning or governing more?
Both.
Really?
Yeah.
Usually it's one or the other.
I love campaigning. I did not enjoy the presidential campaign. I mean, and unfortunately it showed. I mean, I just found these kinds of, the walling off and all of that kind of stuff very difficult, because I was a guy that loved to campaign. I loved to campaign out there with people all the time, and I'd had the good fortune to be able to do that as governor. But I enjoyed campaigns and I enjoyed governing. And the two really go hand in hand. I mean, you can't divide the two, because, look, one of the things you do in a campaign is put together an agenda and try to give people a sense of what you're going to do if you get elected. And if you get elected, I mean, the day after that election, you're beginning to put together an administration, putting your agenda together, and starting to go to work. So, no, I enjoyed them both.
So then when you didn't become president, you decided not to run again. Why?
Well, I was in the middle of a third term. And so I went right back to Massachusetts and started being governor again. And unfortunately, that was the beginning of a severe recession that we had in this country from 89 to 91 or 92. And the two coasts were hit particularly hard. Pete Wilson walked into a $15 billion deficit in California, and our economy, which had done extraordinarily well. I mean, the Massachusetts miracle was not a myth. I mean, we had come from near depression conditions to one of the most successful states in the country from an economic standpoint. So I really had a tough last couple of years trying to keep things together. I didn't have time to, feel sorry about myself. But that was my third and final term, and I left office at the end of 1990, and then went into teaching, and I've been teaching.
But no interest in another run for presidency?
Not if I want to stay married. I mean, Kitty, look, Kitty's been wonderfully supportive herself, is deeply involved actively in politics and public life and stuff. But, I did not do well in that campaign.
Right.
And a lot of people
learned so much from it.
But a lot of people were disappointed. I mean, you rarely, in this country, you rarely have a second chance. I mean, Nixon's coming back was very unusual.
But then when you were governor, you had lost the governor race and then came back.
That's a little different. And I learned some things from that loss, came back, and was a much better governor the second time around than I was the first time around. Doing it for the presidency is very tough.
Oftentimes you hear, and it happened with Hillary, it happens with a lot of candidates, oh, I'm not interested in running for president. And everyone in the media says they're running for president. Oh, no, I'm not. At what point did you know you seriously wanted to run for president?
I'd never even thought about it until after I was reelected as governor the third time in the fall of 1986. And then the Iran-Contra scandal hit us. And we had this spectacle of a president and vice president of the United States lying to the Congress, lying to the American people, violating the law, documents being burned in the basement of the White House. And I, quite frankly, was appalled. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And I looked at this thing and I said, this is terrible. And it was only then, quite frankly, that I started thinking about it. And then I took several months to think seriously about it. I mean, this is not, I had just been reelected by an overwhelming majority as governor. I still had a lot of things I wanted to do. I was very proud of what we'd been able to do in Massachusetts, but there was much more that I wanted to do. And finally, after thinking about it, spending time talking to people, picking their brains and so on, finally in the spring of '87, I decided I'd run. But I said at the time it was a long shot, and by the way, a marathon, and it is. And remarkably, was able to win that primary and then unfortunately screwed up the final.
When you decide you're going to run for president, though, and I don't know that any of us other than you can, or people that have been in your position, can understand what kind of a weight that is on someone. And it's not just getting another job. It is going to be so important. If you win, you have. Is there ever any time where you, in a sense, panic about it, where you think, what have I gotten myself into?
No, you don't panic, but I spent a lot of time before I made the decision thinking about this for two reasons. First, my family is the most important thing in my life. I'm married to a great woman. We have 3 wonderful kids, now 7 grandkids. If just one member, if Kitty or any of my 3 kids had said, Dad, don't want you to do this, I would have never done it. If any one of my children had still been in high school, nothing against the folks that run with young kids, and I think the Clintons and the Gores did a remarkable job with their kids, but if just one of our kids had still been in high school, I would have not run under any circumstances. Fortunately, our youngest by that time was in college. But how my family felt about it was very important to me. Now, so happens they all were they were more enthusiastic about my running than I was. And the second question you got to ask yourself is, can I do the job? I mean, this is the most important political office in the world. I mean, you have it within your power to blow the world up and destroy it.
Right.
And in those days, remember, we still were kind of at the tail end of the Cold War, but the finger on the button thing. So I spent a lot of time this may surprise you, talking to people whose judgment I respected, saying, now look, don't blow a lot of smoke at me. Do you really think I can do the job? And give me an honest answer, because I was concerned about that.
And I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but was there one comment, one thought, one moment that made you say, yeah, I can do this?
No, it was an evolving thing. I mean, at first it was 10-1 against it. You know, I said, well, I'll take a look at it. You know, a number of my friends and colleagues had said, you really ought to look at this thing. This is an opportunity. 8 years of Reagan, we want to get something else. But it evolved over time. Again, my family's feeling about this was the most important thing to me, but the judgment of people whose opinion I respected was important to me. But and finally I came to the conclusion it was worth taking a shot at.
What did you learn about yourself from all the mudslinging that happened? When you sit alone with yourself, what lessons do you take away from all of that?
If you're going to run for the presidency of the United States, particularly if you're a Democrat, you better expect an attack campaign to begin these days, even before you clinch the nomination, and you better be ready for it. I was not. Now, Bill Clinton, to his credit, learned from my demise. And Clinton's campaign in '92 not only was ready for the Bush attack campaign, and it was every bit as tough, if not more so. People tend to forget this, and it wasn't my case. He had a small unit of about 10 people in his campaign, some of whom would work for me, who did nothing all day long but deal with the Bush attack campaign. In fact, they called themselves the Defense Department. And before Bush attacked, they had an answer. I mean, they were on this from the beginning. And unfortunately, you have to do that. Now, you know, you don't want to get down. If the other guy gets down the gutter, you don't want to get down there with him. But you've got to be ready for this, and you've got to have a carefully thought out strategy for dealing with it. Otherwise, what happened to me will happen to you.
Yeah. I know that you talk now a lot about building from a precinct level up.
Right.
And that's what you need to do. Can you talk a little about that?
It was another mistake I made, and shame on me, because the only reason I'd gotten elected to local office, to the state legislature, and to the governorship 3 times was because we had organized at the precinct level, and I mean organized, every precinct with a precinct captain and block captains, making personal contact on an ongoing basis with every single voting household, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And that's the way we won the nomination in the key primary states. Well, the folks who were supposed to know something about running for the presidency in those days said, well, you don't do that in the final. It's all money and media. And I bought into that, with some exceptions. We had a pretty good precinct operation in California, but not many other places. And it was a terrible mistake. And frankly, the Democratic Party has forgotten how to do precinct-based grassroots organizing these days in presidential campaigns. And we've bought into this red-blue nonsense, red states, blue states. A lot of foolishness. I was out in Kansas speaking at the Robert Dole Public Policy Institute not too long ago. About 500 people showed up. Kansas is a red state, right? So how come they have a woman Democratic governor? And yet we Democrats are buying into this. Now look, if you concede half the country to the other side without a fight, you're going to have a tough time winning the presidency. And I think it's a mistake. So I think no matter who the nominee is this time around, we've got to organize every single one of the 200,000 precincts in the United States of America, including every precinct in the state of Texas, something we haven't done for years. And get out there and start connecting with real people. Look, most Americans are very unhappy about what's going on these days, not just in the Middle East. The economy's starting to fall apart. This foreclosure thing is a fiasco. Never should have been permitted to happen. But we've got to connect with these folks on a very personal basis. And these precinct captains must be people who live in the precinct, look like the precinct, walk like the precinct, and talk like the precinct. We're not talking about parachuting kids in with 2 weeks to go. That's not what we're talking about here. So my hope is that we'll get serious about this now as we decide who our nominee is going to be, and we're out there with a field organization, the likes of which we haven't done in years and years and years. If we do this, we're going to win the presidency, and we're going to expand the Democratic majority in the Congress. But if we don't do it, we'll be back in attack ad land again.
Right.
And we just can't afford to do that. The country can't afford that, in my opinion.
Okay, guilty pleasure question for me. When you call up to concede an election to the other candidate, what do you say? How does that moment happen?
In my case, you say, Mr. Vice President, congratulations. It was tough, it was a good fight. You won. I can be supportive in any way, let me know.
In the 1 minute we have left, and it's an unfair question in such a short period of time, but sometimes people now are saying, you know, America, it's turning into a failed experiment. It's not working anymore. How do you address that?
I think that's baloney. We're still the greatest democracy in the world. An enormous number of very good people are working hard to make their communities and state and country a better place. It's one of the extraordinary things about America, the number of people who give of themselves. But speaking as a Democrat, my party has got to do a much better job than I did and others have done to win the presidency, because ultimately that's the most important thing. Look, we're living under what I think is the worst national administration I've ever lived under. And shame on us. It's time to change that. We're a better country than we've shown over the past 7 years, and I have great faith in this. I'm teaching young people these days who are terrific. Let me tell you, we're producing terrific young people in this country, and I'm teaching them every day. So I'm very optimistic about the future, but it does take political leadership that understands what this country's values are all about, and that's what this election is all about.
Well, Governor, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Great to be with you.
Pleasure. Michael Dukakis.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of Interviews, please visit HoustonPBS.org.